Welcome to Unpacking Peanuts, the podcast where three cartoonists take an in-depth look at the greatest comic strip of all time, Peanuts by Charles M. Schulz.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. This is Unpacking Peanuts, the show where we, for better or for worse, look at every year of Charles Schulz's comic strip masterpiece, Peanuts. I'll be your host for the proceedings. My name's Jimmy Gownley, and wouldn't you know it, I'm a cartoonist too. I do things like Amelia Rules, 7 Reasons Not to Grow Up, The Dumbest Idea Ever, and my new comics can be seen now, serialized at gvillecomics.substack.com. Joining me as always are my pals, co-hosts, and fellow cartoonists. He's a playwright and a composer, both for the band Complicated People as well as for this very podcast. He's the co-creator of the original comic book price guide, the original editor for Amelia Rules, and the creator of such great strips as Strange Attractors, A Gathering of Spells, and Tangled River. It's Michael Cohen.
Say hey.
And he's the executive producer and writer of Mystery Science Theater 3000, a former vice president of Archie Comics, and the creator of the Instagram sensation Sweetest Beasts. It's Harold Buchholz.
Hello.
Well, guys, this is extremely exciting here today. Today, we are hosting one of the legends of daily cartooning, one of the greatest comic strip artists of all time, and a personal friend of Mr. Charles M. Schulz, Lynn Johnston, creator of For Better or For Worse. Welcome to Unpacking Peanuts. And Lynn, thank you so much for being here today. It's a huge thrill for us.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure.
So, you are one of the few people, I think, in the world who would have an inkling what Charles Schulz's life is like, having been such a phenomenally successful cartoonist for so long. But can you take us back to your origin story? When was it that you first encountered Peanuts, and what was the effect it had on you?
Gosh, I must have been about 5, I guess, or yeah, I would think around then. I did not get along with my maternal grandfather. He was a very stodgy British gentleman who preferred boys, and he didn't tolerate me too well. But the both of us loved the comics, and so we would sit on the sofa, and I would sit next to him because his house was always freezing, and we would go over the comics. And he would read everything, and he would analyze everything. And of course, in those days, there was Moon Mullins and Popeye and Alley-Oop and all of those classics, Dick Tracy. Mm-hmm. And Peanuts was one of the favorites. And he really hated it. He thought it was terrible. He said, children don't talk like that. That's the most ridiculous thing. But he would read them aloud to me before I could read. And I realized that maybe kids don't talk like that, but we sure think that way about fairness and, just objective things, the things that you notice around town and the way your friends treat you. And I thought, yeah, it's a different vocabulary, but it's absolutely the way kids think. And I was always impressed by the way he treated that Sparky, Peanuts, treated kids as adults, because in a way, we have many of we certainly when it comes to fairness and relationships, we're pretty savvy.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And, I think it's something, I wonder how much of that even Schulz even understood, because he always said he wasn't writing for children, but boy, do children get it. And that's like a special kind of genius, don't you think?
He might not have been writing for children, but you never grow up. You never, ever grow up completely. You don't. In fact, my husband and I were talking the other day about injustices that happened to us when we were children, the way our parents treated us, or kids that bullied us in school, or if we bullied kids. And we could rocket right back to those days. We could remember the hurt and remember the embarrassment and remember punishments that weren't due and all those things. And we were thinking, we are both 78 years old. How is it that these things still affect us today? And it does. It really does. Whatever crap went on in your childhood, you're going to remember when you're my age. Honest to goodness, it's crazy.
Oh, I know that. I absolutely know that.
If you're a parent, take heed.
Yeah. No, it's true. When you're a parent, you are worried. Is this little thing I'm doing now going to scar them for life? How much therapy is this going to cause this person to go to?
A lot of therapy, and you might pay. Yeah.
I see that in For Better or For Worse. There's so much in there where there's observation of how, one generation affects the other. And and you're not always noticing how you're affecting the other person.
When I was offered the opportunity to do the strip, I had worked with a publisher in Minneapolis, and he sent some little cartoon books I did to Universal Press Syndicate, and they sent me a 20-year contract. Wow. And so when I went to Kansas City to meet these people, what they were looking for was something to rival High and Lois and Blondie and Family Circus, because they were all done by men, and they were all very fanciful about dad comes home from work and he, comes to a perfect home with a perfect wife with perfect hair and perfect kids. And there might be funny things happening with the dog, but it was so unreal. It was, it was so fanciful. And so they wanted the dirty diapers and the bad moods and the ups and downs, the honest ups and downs of marriage, which was what I had done in my little cartoon books. Mm-hmm. And so, I signed this 20-year contract, and the strip began in 79.
Yep.
Yeah.
Right. I have a question for you. Was it always intended that you were going to age the characters like that? Was that part of the initial idea? Or how did that come about? Because it's so rare and it's so unique.
No, I get bored very easily. And when you're doing gag a day, it gets boring. And it's also not possible to sustain a really good comic strip without other writers for gag a day. It really is not.
Yeah.
Sparky tried it, and he was probably one of the rare beasts who never used writers. But I felt that, if I was going to, do a real serious kick at the can, I better be the best I can possibly be with this tiny little bit of real estate. If you're going to do it, do it well. So I realized early on that gag a day, I was going to need writers, and also it was going to affect my children because it was based on our family.
Right.
So I allowed my children to grow up 3 years before I started to age the characters. And then I started to age the characters. And for me, that was the best decision possible because it gave me a lot more material. It gave me lots more in that the kids, their behavior changes, the vocabulary changes. They've got friends outside the home. There were so many more possibilities for humor and controversy and relationships with the characters growing. But in having them grow, I denied myself the possibility of licensing. So you can't do... you can't do a Pampers box because by the time the box arrives on the shelf, the baby is now 3. Right. It usually takes 3 years because they got to get rid of the old product. So that you've got to sign a contract. It usually takes a year to get that done and blah, blah. So licensing was not a possibility. But we did regular books that came out every year, collection books, and we did calendars and greeting cards. And it was a very busy life.
Can you talk a little bit about the unrelenting nature of drawing a daily comic strip? You did it for almost 30 years, I think.
I did.
I cannot imagine. And your art, is beautiful. It's detailed. The stories are complex. Can you just talk about what that is like for those of us who will never draw a daily comic strip, what that schedule means?
At first, you're in panic mode. Like in the first year, you really are under a lot of stress and a lot of pressure because it's a brand new job and it's unrelenting. And people think, oh, you just do a drawing a day and send it off. But you have to they won't accept anything under a week's worth, except if you're Gary Trudeau. He could send in 3 at a time because it was so, political and so, he was an editorial cartoonist, really, yes. So he was probably the rare bird who could send his work in a bit at a time, but the rest of us couldn't send in anything less than a week. And if you were late, you were fined $100, right?
Whoa.
You only need one of those fines before you realize that you got to be on that deadline. Because the Sunday comics had to go to Buffalo to be colored and then distributed. And your work is appearing in Guam and Australia and Japan. And, and in those days, there was no real electronic transfer. Fax machine was just invented, or I think it was invented many years ago, but private family fax machines were only just available. Yeah. So I would fax my pencil roughs to Lee Salem, who was my editor. He was a great editor. And he and I would go over everything. And when he approved of my work, I would ink it. And then I would send it by Grey Goose bus from Lynn Lake, Manitoba. Oh, no. Honestly, it was a full day drive for the bus to get to Winnipeg, and then it would go by courier from there. So I had to be, and you have to be 6 weeks ahead of the dailies, 8 weeks ahead of the Sundays because of the distribution and the coloring. So you're really on the hook. You've got to do this. But, if you sign a contract and you've got a sense of responsibility, you do it. Right. And I guess the worst part is not knowing when or how the ideas are going to come. But when you're young and you're energetic, those ideas are often faster than you can write them down. Mm-hmm. So I was blessed with that good fortune, and that the muse hung around me a lot, even though I was a busy mom of 2 young kids. And I would work early in the morning. My son would go to school. My daughter would go to a friend across the street, and I would work from 9 to noon. And then get the kids' lunches. Then I would later on work after dinner till sometimes 4 a.m, and then sleep a few hours and get up and deal with the kids again. So it was a really busy time. But when you're young, you can do these things. So I eventually learned how to get into a rhythm and a routine. I eventually started to trust myself that even if I couldn't think of a thing on Monday, on Tuesday, I would be able to write, and I could write 2-3 weeks of dailies in a day, but just write. And then the next day I would start the pencil, and then the next day I would do the ink. So, and then you've got the Sunday page, which is much bigger, and that all had to be color coded for the colorists in Buffalo. So that was a huge job. And I eventually hired someone who was a really good artist to help me with that. And I also, years later, I hired someone to help me with the background illustration. So about, 15 years before I retired, I was working with a background artist as well. I did the main characters, and I did all the art in pencil, but I would ink the main characters because I wanted those expressions to be just right. Yeah. And then I would hand everything over to my friend Laura, who would do all the backgrounds. So then I could really put in detail, like every little bottle on a shelf and every leaf on a tree and brick on a building,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Lynn, I wanted to ask you mentioned what a great editor Lee Salem was, and you really were pioneering a different type of strip. And because of what you had done in those 3 books that you had created, they saw something, I think, in your work that would fill a niche that really didn't exist. I know Kathy Geiswhite was kind of blazing some trails with some of the things she was doing, but the way you approached the strip was so unique and so different. I was just wondering about that relationship. How involved was your syndicate and Lee with you through that process of developing? Did it continue through the whole stretch of the strip, or at some point did they just kind of let you go and do the thing you were doing?
I had tremendous freedom. I really did. But anything that is as complicated as this, it has a rough start. Sure. And so I asked for a creative contract to begin with. So I had a 6-month creative contract before the strip went live. And Lee and I worked together with the fax machine for 6 months. And it was an eye opener because I had never written dialogue, statement, gag, statement, gag, reaction, and so there's a flow and a rhythm to these things. And I really had to learn how to do it. I also had to get rid of any thoughts of any X-rated stuff, if I was going to show a butt crack or talk about a fart or any of the, the poo or whatever happens in the family, I couldn't get away with anything. In fact, years later, Bill Watterson and I were the only 2 that ever got a butt crack in the paper. And we cheered. We snuck it in.
That is amazing. That is.
Yeah. So those first 6 months, Lee and I worked very closely together, and then there were editors there who were kind of wacky, who wanted everything to be American. They wanted American spelling and American situations. They wanted me to, celebrate Memorial Day and anything that was American. And I said, I'm Canadian. Right. The strip is, sort of centered in Southern Ontario. If you want me to do that, you've got the wrong artist here. You better hire someone else to do this and start their own story. Uh-huh. And Lee was my champion, said, this is what we want. We want everything that is right for you and do what you need to do. So they might change my grammar, or they might change something else, or they might suggest that one strip could be improved by doing X. But for the most part, I was left alone. And I had another editor with Lee. Her name was Sue Rausch, and I keep in touch with Sue now. The two of us write back and forth, and I sent her the collection books. And I loved working with Lee, and I loved working with Sue. They were great people, and they never did anything that was unnecessary. You know, some people are a bit of a gatekeeper, and if they think they have a bit of power, they will needle you and get you to change something just because they want to say, I got her to change it. They never did anything like that. They were very, very supportive, and I had a great relationship with both of them. Besides, I was one of the few cartoonists they said I was always on time.
That'll get you a lot of plays if you just show up on time.
They're happy, yeah. Well, so that 6 months, it was so smart of you to say, I need this time to develop the 6 months. So when you were describing that period, pretty much once you had finished your 6 months of preparation, did any of the strips that you did in those 6 months kind of build into what you were doing, or were you essentially starting from scratch?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No, there were a lot of keepers in that 6 months, and so I would ink them and send them in. Yeah. And
then was Lee pretty much more hands off after you were in the actual day-to-day process of making the strips?
No, he was very involved. He was very involved. We would talk about, every time I would send a week of dailies, he would call, and we would talk about everything from the quality of the line to the way the lettering was done, and there were sometimes my hand lettering wasn't clear, for example. It's not just the gag and the illustration that's important, but it's just every way you present the artwork. If it's not legible, you've got to think of that.
Right. Well, I'm so glad to hear a positive story of someone who worked with an editor, and you were really a team to make something special. That's really nice to hear.
I had great editors.
Yeah, Harold never hears stories about editors being good from me.
Of course, we have an amazing editor for our podcast.
Can you tell us a little bit, to get into the real nitty gritty of it, when you were inking those faces, what were you inking it with?
At the time, I was using a flexible speedball nib, C6 speedball nib, and Winsor Newton ink, which was at the time opaque and the best ink I could find. And because I was living almost in the Arctic, it was a really distant place. I had to bring my stuff up from Winnipeg or order it. And I would use Strathmore bond paper. It was quite a nice thickness. And I would cut it all up, and I made templates out of cardboard, and I would put the template down on my little sheet, and I would pencil in my squares and then start working.
Wow.
That's brilliant to do the template like that, because that just the repetition of drawing up the panel borders for every day. It's I don't think, the idea with cartooning is that it goes by so breezily, but people don't consider how much work goes into making it seem so breezy, Yeah.
Well, everything looks simple. A movie looks simple when you go to the theater, right? A movie looks simple. You go in, it's a couple of hours, you eat your popcorn, and you go home. And it never occurs to you all the editing and the sound and, everything, the location. I mean, it's years of work in that 2-hour experience, but yet you don't know about it, don't think about it. You just enjoy the product. So that's the same as any artwork, painting, or anything you do. And so again, with the comic strip, you get into a routine. I did it all in pencil because I wanted to change the borders sometimes. I would make the first panel a little bigger than the second one or something. So I didn't have them printed up. Charles Schultz had them printed up. His panels were already printed with the word Peanuts up on the upper left.
Yeah.
And one day when I was in his studio, he was telling me he was going to go to a different format and would have to throw out all of these long panels. And I measured the panels, and I said, each one of your panels is twice the length of mine. Can I have your paper? And so he sent me a box of his paper, all with Peanuts printed on it, and I split it all in half, turned it over, and I worked on the back. And so for a number of years, every For Better For Worse panel came out with a Peanuts sign on the back.
That is amazing. That is so cool.
Yeah, it was fun.
Can you tell us about the first time you met him?
Well, he called me in about 1985, And I was sitting in my studio and I got this call. And by then I had moved from this tiny little Arctic town down to a much less north town. It was called North Bay, Ontario in Canada. And I was in my basement studio and my phone rang. And this thing came up and I said hello and this strange voice. And I said, who is this? And he said, Charles Schultz. And I said, who? Thinking somebody was pranking me, right? You always think your friends are pranking you. And he said rather apologetically, I do peanuts. And I was just speechless. And he told me how much he liked my work. And it was such a wonderful compliment to have somebody who had been in the business for so long and was so well known to say that he liked my work. And he was genuine about it. We had a lovely conversation. And then about a year later at the Rubin Awards in Washington, Kathy Geisweit introduced me to him. And when he shook my hand, he bent over and said, I voted for you. And that was the year I won. I won the Rubin Award.
Wow. That is a good day. Not only did you win, but Charles Schultz said he voted for you. That's a good day.
Well, we hung out together, the bunch of us, Sparky and Jeannie and Kathy and myself. And at one point we were walking down, one of the many avenues in Washington, and it was just about to be his 65th birthday. And Kathy and I were singing, will you still need me? Will you still see me? And he turned around and said, stop that. I don't want to be 65. I don't want to be 60 or 64. I don't want to be 64. So when we met, he was 64 and I was in my 30s.
Now, you had to be real competition to him. I mean, because for better or for worse, was in, I don't know if you know this, but quite a few papers. Now,
it was.
So what, he was a competitive guy. Did you ever sense that? Like, who's this lady coming on the outside?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. If he thought that you were encroaching on his space in any way, he was not friendly. And I'm not kidding.
Wow.
And at one point, I think that his work had been in the Louvre. He had gone to Paris and, his work was in the Louvre. And at one point, my work was in over 2,000 papers. And we were somewhere at a coffee shop or something. And I leaned over and I said, I'm catching up to you, Sparky. And he said, I'll see you in the Louvre. And he said it in a way that was really, it wasn't nice.
Wow.
It wasn't nice.
Wow.
We've often spoken about how the Peanut strip is so sports oriented, more so than most other strips. And he was probably more sports oriented than most other cartoonists. And that competitive streak in him really does come out.
Absolutely. His wife, Jeannie, hated playing tennis with him because she said he was such a good winner. He loved to win. And he would sort of look at you as if to say, aha, so there. But he was certainly he was really an athlete. He played hockey and tennis and golf. And, he really was competitive, but he was also very good at what he did. And I know at one time he came down to Kansas City, and there was, I think the Rubens was in Kansas City, and we were doing a tour of the syndicate, and they were really easygoing guys, those Kansas City guys, and they were all golfers. And they came up with the BGA, the Bad Golfers Association, and they had hats and scarves, and they had club covers and caddy bags, and they had all this stuff with BGA written on it, meaning the Bad Golfers Association. So they knew Sparky was a golfer. And when he came into the building, they gave him this massive collection of BGA stuff, the hat, the whole thing. And when he got back to the hotel, he said, do you want this stuff? Because I'm going to throw it out because I am not a bad golfer. Yeah.
A lot of us who deal with humor and comedy, we often get so much of that humor out of insecurity. What did you sense from him in terms of, as a person, how he dealt with that insecurity? Yeah.
He talked about it, but he had such clout. He was wealthy. He was well known. He was handsome. He was articulate. I mean, he had it all. You tick off all the boxes for success, and he had it. If he was haunted by insecurity, it goes right back to his childhood. And as I was saying before, you never lose that. You never forget those insults and those bullies and the time that your mom sent you to your room. I mean, you never forget the injustices of your childhood or the insecurities or the embarrassments. And he brought that with him always. You know, he always had that in the back of his mind. But as an adult, he was kind of a smug winner.
That's so interesting.
I read a story once about his reaction to one of your strips, and I think this has some sort of insight into him, but I'm not sure what. So I'll ask you. When Farley the dog passed away, and you told him, I guess, that was coming up. He got very upset, right? I mean, he was invested still like a fan. Could you tell a little bit about that story?
Well, yeah, I told him, I mean, we were very close and I knew him very well. And my husband and I had an aircraft and we could fly long distances. At this point, we had a Navajo aircraft, which, you know, it's a high altitude, very fast aircraft. My husband was a really good pilot. So we spent a lot of time out in California. We would go out there for the Christmas show and, you know, for all kinds of events. So we were always out there. And so, I told Sparky that I was planning on doing this because with the characters growing and aging and changing, the dog was now 13. And my sister-in-law was a veterinarian and she said, old English sheepdogs don't live that long. You've got to deal with this. But she said, make him go a hero. Don't have him go to the vet. She said, that's the saddest thing. Just make him go a hero. And so I took that to heart and I told Sparky I really had to deal with the age of the dog and I was going to have to bump him off, right? Well, Sparky was furious. He was furious. He said, if you kill Farley the dog, I'm going to have Snoopy hit by a truck and sent to the hospital. And he was serious. And he said, and everybody's going to care about Snoopy and nobody's going to care about your dumb story, he said.
Wow. Holy cow.
So I thought, and he was serious. He never swore. So you're a dumb story, right? So I went home and I said to myself, I guess I better do this without telling him when or how, because he's just going to have Snoopy hit by a truck and I don't want that to happen. Poor Snoopy, right? So I devised this story where April goes down to the creek behind their house. For a while, years ago, I had lived in a house on a ravine. So the For Better For Worse house was sort of based on that house. And down in the ravine, there was a river that would, in the springtime, really be a fast, deep little river. And the kids were told to stay away. So April goes down into the ravine and Farley's with her and she's got a toy boat. She puts the boat in the river, goes after the boat, goes underwater. He brings her up. The other dog runs to the house, it's very dramatic. Mm-hmm. The dog holds April's head out of the water and the family pulls her out of the water and she's fine. But the dog dies from the exhaustion. He's an old dog and he dies in April's arms. Well, it was all very dramatic. And I have to digress a little bit and say the saddest thing about this was that it happened at the time of the Oklahoma bombing. And you never know what's going to be in the headlines because your work is sent in 6 to 8 weeks in advance, right? Mm-hmm. So I had done this story 6 weeks before and certainly never thought about what the headlines would be. And you can't predict the future. So when this happened, it was terribly upsetting to everyone who read the strip because they did not need to see a sad story at this time. Everybody, it was the most outrageous act of terrorism and the most egregious loss of life at the time. And I mean, we're almost getting used to that now, but at the time it scarred and hurt everyone. And so I was vilified for doing this story at this time. Oh, no. Yeah.
It's a beautiful story.
So Sparky was furious.
As cartooning, it's great.
Well, he phoned me during the strip when the story ended. And when I picked up the phone, the first thing he said was, that stupid little girl. Oh. That stupid little girl. Why did she go down to the river? Why? That stupid little girl. And at that point, I realized how invested he was in the comics, that he actually lived inside them, right? Instead of blaming me, he blamed the character.
That's amazing. And what a compliment it is to your work, though, because if there's one person who understands that comics are just something that someone draws on a piece of paper, it would be Charles Schulz. And for him to be that invested in it, I mean, that it really speaks to your characters and your work.
It's Farley. I mean, Farley was such a beloved dog. My wife's family named one of their dogs Farley. So, it's obviously you had quite an impact with it.
There were a lot of Farleys out there.
Well, listen, how about we take a break right now, get a quick beverage, and then when we come back, we're going to talk about some of your favorite Peanuts comics characters and how you might think they might relate to the real Charles Schulz. Does that sound like a plan?
Sure. Sounds good.
Awesome. Okay, so everybody, we'll be back on the other side of this.
Hi, everyone. We all love listening to Jimmy describe what's going on in a Peanut strip. But comics are actually a visual medium. You can see them anytime you want at gocomics.com or in your very own copy of The Complete Peanuts, available from Fantagraphics. Plus, if you sign up for our monthly newsletter, you'll know in advance which strips we're talking about each week. Learn more about the Great Peanuts reread at unpackingpeanuts.com.
And we're back. So you were saying we've done almost 140 episodes of this thing now, and whenever we see something like from like the mainstream press or whatever talking to Charles Schulz, they would always say, "Well, you're probably Charlie Brown, right?" And he would say, "Yes, I guess I am." But you see it differently. You see him a little bit in all of the characters, and could you tell us a little bit about what your favorite ones are?
He would tell you, if you want to know me, if you want to know who I am, read my work. Because I am all the characters. He would say that to you. Wow. And he was right, because he could be as sort of down and out as Charlie Brown, as aggressive and mean and kind of cruel as Lucy. Mm-hmm. He could be as pensive as Linus. He loved music, especially jazz. And so Schroeder was right in there with his focus on the piano. And all of the characters, I think eventually when I met Billie Jean King, I realized that Peppermint Patty was Billie Jean King, absolutely, and for real. And all of the characters were based on him, but also people that he knew, family, friends, teachers, people from his past. Again, he never let go of his childhood. And so all of the characters meant something to him, but they often meant other things to other people. And people connect with Charlie Brown a great deal because, and they always wished he would kick the football. And in fact, when he knew he was dying, we all said to him, "Well, Sparky, is Charlie Brown going to be able to kick the football?" And he would just smile and not say, right? Mm-hmm. He didn't say. So we thought, well, maybe he will, but he never did.
Now, when you would spend time with him, would you be able to notice the characters and go like, that's a Lucy moment there, Sparky? Or was it that obvious to you?
Absolutely. Oh, yeah. There were times when he was really mean. In fact, Jim Davis was a good friend of mine. He does Garfield. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And Garfield was becoming more and more and more popular to the point where he was really, right up there. And people were talking about Garfield. And Jim and I got to know each other quite well. Jim also had an airplane. And we would fly down to Muncie, Indiana, and my daughter grew up with Jim's son. And, we know each other, all of us. We go to the Reuben Awards every year, but otherwise we would call and visit. I mean, it's a unique group of people, and we all connect in different ways, but we all are very supportive and fond of each other. So Jim wanted Sparky's friendship. He wanted to get to know him. He wanted to be invited into the inner circle as another cartoonist who was doing well, and Sparky rejected him. He was rude to him, and he was very smug and happy when Garfield was not successful in Japan, because Garfield is rude to his owner, right? Yeah. Garfield is not a pleasant character. Garfield is rude to his owner, and he is ugly and burps and eats and, is a gross character. And he appeals to 9-year-old boys all over the world, but Japan said, no, thank you. And Sparky was thrilled. He was absolutely thrilled. Ha ha, ha. Wow. So that kind of competitiveness, I didn't find that endearing at all. I thought that was mean and unnecessary.
Yeah. Was the nature of your friendship such that you could call him or would choose to call him out on some of those things, or would you just kind of let it slide?
Oh, yeah.
Did he ever take it to heart, or did he say, well, maybe I've gone too far, or how did that play out?
No. No. In fact, I got to tell you a story. One time he phoned me and he said, I am so frustrated. I've got to get a daily out, and I can't. He said, I've got 5 done. I need 6. I got the Sunday. He said, I'm missing one, and I can't think of a thing. He said, I got out of bed this morning, and he said, I was in a terrible mood. He said, I was depressed, but he said, I was happy one minute, depressed the next. He said, I'm on the bungee cord of life. And up and down, up and down. I'm on the bungee cord of life, he said. I said, Sparky, there's number 6.
That's the script.
What? He says. And I said, bungee cord of life. That's number 6. I'm up and down, up and down. I'm on the bungee cord of life. I said, there's your punchline. There's number 6.
We just covered that one recently.
He said, you came up with that. I said,
So he wouldn't even take it, even though he said it. That's so funny.
well, he kept saying that it was my idea.
He said it was your idea, even though he had said it.
Well, we argued. And I said to him, no, it's absolutely yours. Go over the conversation. You came up with that gag. It's yours. It's not mine. It's yours. So he did it. He did that strip, and he sent it to me. And so I have it on my wall in the studio.
Oh, that's amazing. It's so cool. But I will also say, knowing that he was that competitive and a little bit spiteful, that also makes me like him a little bit more. Do you think that there's an element that has to be there of that type of personality to achieve that kind of worldwide just dominance culturally?
Yeah, you have to be competitive, but you're competitive with yourself.
Yeah.
You also look around to see what other people are doing, but each one of us did something unique to ourselves. I wasn't doing a copycat of anybody.
Right.
And, nobody else was doing a copycat of me. We were all working hard to produce what came out of our soul, right?
Yeah.
And it traveled through your right hand and went out on the paper, and it was you. It was you on the paper. And so, we were all really competitive, and we had deadlines. And you would look at the paper, and we would get the slicks sometimes. You'd see what everybody else was doing. You'd say, aha, Mother Goose and Grimm is getting good. I better up my game a little bit, But we all cared for each other. The competition came with the sales staff at these syndicates. Like the salesman for Better for Worse would go out and say, are you still carrying Blondie? You should be carrying for Better for Worse. Mm. And so I would bump for Blondie, and sometimes Blondie would bump me. Mm-hmm. But I could still be friends with the Young family. I knew Charlotte and Dean Young very well, and the folks that produced Blondie I knew well, but I wasn't going out personally and saying, hey, take mine instead of theirs. So it was all of the competition that way was done with the salespeople and by the syndicates. And so we were left to get together, and some of us became very close friends.
That's wonderful. Could I ask, who would you consider was in that inner circle of cartoonists with Charles Schulz, along with you and some of the others you were mentioning?
It varied. It varied. There, it usually you came to a breakfast table at the Rubens. Sparky always had a table where he would invite his favorite people to sit with him at breakfast, and it varied. There were editors and cartoonists and salespeople, and when Patrick does Mutts. McDonald, when he came on the scene, he loved Patrick, and even though his characters were little dogs and charming, they didn't, it wasn't Snoopy like, and they weren't in this, they weren't rivals in any way, but he loved the charm of Patrick's work. So Patrick was part of that. There were quite a few people who were invited to the table, but it wasn't always cartoonists. Kathy was always there. If she was in the building, she was there. I mean, it varied, but I was usually at the table, and I felt very honored to be there.
It feels like that period, like the 80s into the 90s, was a real renaissance of newspaper cartooning. All those people that you mentioned are all great. Mutz was great. Calvin and Hobbes. You were working, Kathy Schulz. Were you aware that, this is a really good time?
At the time, we knew that the papers were starting to atrophy. They were starting to amalgamate. But we never expected to see comic strips as we knew them to disappear the way they have now.
Yeah.
We, when they started to shrink them down, and they would shrink them or stretch them so they could squeeze one more in, so you'd see your strip with the characters looking like that screaming painting, and you'd say, what the heck have they done? Because they've squeezed I think the people that do the squeezing don't care about the art. They just want to get one more comic strip in. And they were, it went from you having this massively colorful, big, full page, like I read with my grandfather. And you went from that to these scrawny little, sort of scraps of bits and pieces that eventually, showed up in your paper. And I created what I thought in my head was a size-laugh ratio. The smaller you shrink a cartoon, the less funny it is. One time I was flying from Ottawa to back home, and at the airport I picked up a Jim Unger book. It was one of the big collection books, and I didn't have it. So when I got on the plane, I started reading this book, and it was, the 8 by 10 big collection book. And I was laughing out loud, and I was kind of embarrassed because people on the plane were saying, "Who's that idiot? What the heck is she laughing at?" And I'd roar and laughing out loud. But then, you'd look at the same cartoon shrunk down to the size of a postage stamp, and you'd say, that's funny.
Yeah, well, especially with your artwork, which is so detailed, it's so reliant on little things and facial expressions and stuff.
Yeah, I got that from a cartoonist by the name of Lynn Norris. I think everybody who wants to go into the industry, they know from the age of 5 that they are smitten with illustration that is exciting and fun and full of interest. And there was a cartoonist at the Vancouver Sun here in BC. His name was Lynn Norris. He was the editorial cartoonist, and they gave him almost a quarter page. And his work was wonderful. It was beautiful. He'd been an architect, so the illustrations were great. But he was funny. The drawings were hilarious, and he threw in all kinds of extra detail so that you'd spend a full 5 minutes or so looking at this beautiful work. You'd see funny little things in the background, like a bird hanging upside down in a tree, or a car in the ditch, or something that didn't need to be there but was. And you'd say, holy crap, that guy's funny. Funny, funny, funny. Because it wasn't just the gag that was funny, but it was the artwork as well. So as a little kid, I knew that the more you put into an illustration, the more fun the reader has. And I wanted to give that when I got into the industry. I wanted to incorporate that wonderful fun by putting in as much funny detail as I could.
That's great. Could I ask you about a specific character in Peanuts and maybe how you saw that come out in his personality when you were around him? And that would be Linus. Linus.
Well, Sparky was a smart cookie. He was, when you think about editorial cartoons, for example, you cannot do it unless you are very politically astute and are ready to take the crap that comes at you if you make a statement. And so he was a very astute illustrator, and he had a lifetime of connection with the church. He was a biblical scholar. He was well read. He was a very intelligent man, and so that would come out in his work. And Linus certainly had that introspective, thoughtful ability to look at the other side of the coin. What you feel that way, but what about this? Well, that happened, but what if this had happened? And so he had that introspective storytelling skill that you need. But again, this is something, and not to say that I'm smart, but you can't do this if you haven't had some really interesting lifetime experience. And if you haven't been well read, if you're not well educated, it's kind of tough to do a job that requires a lot of thought.
Absolutely.
Right.
My dad was roughly the age of Schultz, and they both were World War II veterans. My dad almost never talked about it, but it obviously deeply affected him. Did that ever come up, those sort of traumatic things?
Oh, yeah. He would talk about that openly and easily if the subject came up, and even if the subject didn't come up. And, And one time at his house, his house has burned down now.
Yeah.
It was destroyed in one of those fires, but I remember absolutely clearly every room of that house because I went around the house and I took photographs. I asked Jeannie, I love the house.
Yeah.
And I'm digressing slightly here, but they had to go downtown to a meeting and I was staying with them. And I said, would you mind if I photograph your house? Because I love it. And if I ever get a chance to build a little place, I'm going to build a house just like this. So Jeannie said, fine. And I said, can I take pictures everywhere? And she said, wherever you like, wherever you like. So I took pictures everywhere in that house. And when the fire came and burned the house down, I was able to send her all those pictures.
Oh,
Wow.
And
Wow.
it was really, really helpful. But in the hallway, one of the photographs that I took was of a drawing that Sparky had done of a street in probably somewhere in Holland or Germany. And he had illustrated this street. And when they came back from their meeting downtown, I pointed out this little illustration, and he said, "I can draw, you know. I really can draw." And he wanted people to know that he was actually a very good artist. He just did not have time to draw and paint because, you know, his extracurriculars were huge. He was never still. He was constantly on the move unless his dog fell asleep on his lap, and then he didn't want to disturb the dog. So he would sit in his chair and he would fall asleep and wait for the dog to wake up. So that it was kind of a blessing. He had this fuzzy little odd rescue dog. And when that little dog ran away and was lost, it broke his heart. He just was,
is that what happened?
So sorry.
Oh, and they never found him again?
Cute little dog.
Yeah.
No, they never got him again.
Oh.
That's heartbreaking. Yeah. We just got to the point in the strip with Andy in it. So, yeah.
It was like a little Jack Russell, something like that. It was a funny little wiry, little white dog with brown spots, and he was just adorable. And Sparky loved this dog. And he would sit down on this big blue leather chair, and the dog would hop onto his lap. And if the dog fell asleep, Sparky would too. And that's one of the rare times I ever saw him still. Otherwise, he was playing golf. He was, out with people. He was going for long walks. They had a nice piece of property. Oh, here's a story for you. One time I was visiting him, and we'd come from an event where I was wearing high heel shoes. And it was the first time I had gone into this lovely house on Upper Ridge Road in Santa Rosa. And I said, what a beautiful piece of property. And he said, well, come and walk with me. Come, I'll show you the property. And my husband at the time had gone into town because he wanted to look around at some of the shops. He was a railroad guy, a train fanatic. And there was a shop in town that sold model railway stuff. So off he went. So I decided to go for a walk around the property with Sparky, but my shoes were high heel shoes. So he said, you don't have, he said, I've got pretty small feet. I'm going to give you a pair of my running shoes and you'll be fine. So he stuffed the toes of the running shoes with Kleenex and the two of us walked around the property. He had a staff with a fork at the top of it. And I didn't realize that was for rattlesnakes.
Oh my gosh.
So we walked around the property and we had a nice chat. And I kept thinking, that staff with the fork on top is interesting. And I would walk over to the edge and look at the view and walk back. And he let me walk through the woods without telling me that there were rattlesnakes.
Oh my
Anyway,
gosh.
we got back to the house and I took off the sneakers and I looked up at him and said, Sparky, I've just walked a mile in your shoes.
That is absolutely amazing. Well, Lynn, thank you so much for taking the time to do this interview. You are one of our favorite cartoonists. Your work is just, one of the towers of the whole field. And for you to take the time out of your day to talk to us about this other cartoonist we love just means everything to us.
Thank you so much.
Well, thanks for the call. I enjoyed talking to you. Thank you.
No problem. We were unbelievably lucky to get Lynn to stop by the studio and chat with us. And it was absolutely a delightful and fun day. What do you think, Harold?
Oh, it was great. It was really cool to hear Lynn share stories of just having that day-to-day friendship with Sparky. And it's cool to hear it directly from her. And she doesn't filter it out. She kind of shares the good and the bad in a very good relationship and friendship she had with him.
One thing I noticed from our interview, the difference between being cartoonist then and now, it seems as if the private jet money has dried up in cartooning these days.
Oh, that's right.
It seemed like people were lousy with private jets in the 80s.
Yeah.
So we got to work on that.
Yeah, all we have is Edward Lear.
Well, listen, honestly, it was such an honor to have Lynn here. So I hope you guys enjoy listening as much as we enjoyed chatting with her. So come back next week and we'll get down to business again. Until then, from Michael, Harold, and Liz, this is Jimmy saying, be of good cheer.
Yes. Be of good cheer. Unpacking Peanuts is copyright Jimmy Gownley, Michael Cohen, Harold Buchholz, and Liz Sumner. Produced and edited by Liz Sumner. Music by Michael Cohen. Additional voiceover by Aziza Shakrala Clark. For more from the show, follow Unpack Peanuts on Instagram and Threads. Unpacking Peanuts on Facebook, Blue Sky, and YouTube. For more about Jimmy, Michael, and Harold, visit unpackingpeanuts.com. Have a wonderful day, and thanks for listening.
Bill Watterson and I were the only two that ever got a butt crack in the paper, and we cheered.